Good morning and welcome to NycosRPG. This is Game Master's Toolbox, a new feature we're adding called Monster in a Minute. Now, this is going to take longer than a minute today because we're setting this up, but ostensibly this will be a way for me to provide some insight and some perhaps some creative fuel for your adventures by adding new monsters and new creature types to your mechanism for the games that you run at home. Now, before you get started, make sure you go down below and hit all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. And let's get going.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game.
Alright, so we're going to be working today with the NycosRPG mechanism only tangentially. I recommend you utilize percentage dice when you get to the point of utilizing them, just because it's simpler, fits into the same motif, and you don't have to come up with something new. The irony is that the amount of energy that we put into creativity and innovation really can be a fairly thin line if we think about it. Sure, we could say we're going to create a new monster, but there are so many things that go into the creation of something that hasn't been used before that you kind of have to have some means of stimulating your creativity. Because if you just try to go off of what you've already done in the past, if you haven't done this recently, it's a bit of a burden. There's more to bite into than perhaps you might think of. And so this resource of Monster in a Minute is simply a way of going over the information in a systematic way so that you get as many of the unanswered questions presented to yourself so that you can have already thought through them before your players engage with them. Now, realizing that, therefore, we're going to be looking at it from the standpoint of what's going on in the game, in the realm that you're playing in, and perhaps why you're coming up with these creatures, as much as we are looking at the how of doing the creation. So the first thing we want to look at is the way it works in-game and the way it works outside of the game. Now, when you are in-game, of course, you've got to be quick on your feet because the players don't want to be sitting there for the 20 minutes or 30 minutes it might take for you to thumb through all of the possible creations. As a matter of fact, this was one of the big points of scaring my players when I was younger, is that if the action of the game isn't dynamic and the players aren't involved in something in particular, they can ramble and discuss and kibitz, and as they waste that time of the story going over that information, you as a game master do have an opportunity to take a few minutes. Of course, when you do, they will be aware of what you're doing, and that changes their dynamics. So, for example, if my players are busy kibitzing and talking about what happened 2 weeks ago or a month ago or 3 years ago, I would just pull up the monster manual back in the day and start flipping through it, looking at things and rolling some dice, and my players automatically assume that what I'm doing is creating an encounter for them because the game isn't moving fluidly along, and therefore I'm going to trigger something, and therefore it does change their dynamics and their playstyle. So much so that I no longer even carry my monster manual with me because my players have already been set on the let's move, let's act bandwagon, so I don't have to pursue that methodology. But this mechanism allows you to do the same thing without needing to have a persona sheet. You can simply pull up without having a monster manual. You simply can pull up a persona sheet and create one of these in just a matter of moments. And so we will walk through the process, and then perhaps at the end we'll actually create a monster together. But make sure you do stay to the end, because I am going to have, by the time we finish this, you will have a complete monster. And in the future, I'll be doing these in 1 minute bursts, and we'll see how that goes. Now the question becomes, why do monsters matter? Well, if you are playing a role-play game and you've been playing with veterans for a long period of time, and they have access to all of the books and they perhaps already own their own copies, they will have a line on how the game is going to go. And when they do, it makes it more difficult for you as a game master because they have already meta-played, in the non game space. They've already worked through, okay, if we run into a troll, for example, trolls are susceptible to fire, so to make sure we have our fire starting equipment close by at hand and we have the resources to create the fight that we want to take to the monster, and therefore it becomes routine for them. They don't have to actually consider what the monster might be. They already have in their mindset how to defeat it. And so having a new monster occasionally, or in the case like Nycos, quite often, the monsters matter because they have to fit into the framework, the biological framework of a location. Otherwise, they fundamentally put themselves out of business, so to speak. And we'll get into that as we go along. But they do matter because they give your adventure and your world a particular theme and flavor. And if you utilize the ones from a routine book that everybody else has, then your world fundamentally to your players is seen as cookie cutter and something that they don't really have to invest in the energy in. And the more you can get a player to invest, the longer and greater their connection to the game world. So let's get going. Okay, so we're going to be creating a monster or a creation, and what is it? What is their niche? Where do they fit in the theme of the adventure? Are they window dressings, something that the players are going to see in the distance, maybe perhaps hunt for food? Is it particularly a predator that they have to worry about either competing with them for resources or maybe hunting the party? What is their... if we were talking about any material product, we would be talking about its unique selling proposition, and that is what makes this creature particularly interesting. And we're going to be picking, in this case, the niche of a parallel creature. What I want is something that can insinuate it into a local population of another creature of a similar type, and thereby disguise their number and hide their actual uniqueness, so that when the players interact with it, it will be seen as something new, mainly because it's not conforming to the regular statistics for that target creature. Now, sometimes these can be one-off, stand-up, singular, one of one, so to speak. But generally, you'll want to have the idea of it filling an economic or ecologic niche in its world, because if it does not suit itself into a unique position, then there's really no reason why it wasn't hunted out of existence by its competitors. And this goes to why a new one. If your players are used to fighting a monster of a certain type and you want to have an encounter, why not just put in the same old one that's already been there? Well, the reason to have something new is to get the players perhaps to change their perspective on dealing with creatures of this type. For example, let's go with something really simple. The classic Dungeons and Dragons orc, what used to be a normal frontline monster that the players had to engage with, and the threat level of this monster was equal to any other humanoid, but the particular nature of the orcs made them psychologically punching bags. They didn't have a identity per se. They were bland cookie cutter uniform. And so we're going to use the idea of the orc as our niche that we're filling. Is we're going to create a creature that's a parallel to them. And why to make a new one is to get the players to consider any population of orc to possibly be this new item, or it could be the traditional old one, or a mix. And the idea is to get them to interact and react to the species perhaps differently than they have in the past. And the easiest way is to shock them with a new version, a new alternative. Another reason to do a new alternative is that the very nature of meta play means that the players are digging into their monster manuals and are constantly aware of what's available as a threat to them. so that when you start to describe, they can already start to formulate their strategy based on the meta knowledge, not necessarily what their persona would know, but that what is perhaps generally known to everyone, and therefore they will argue for their stratagem. By having a new creature type, it's easier for you to what's the term? Subvert their expectations and put them on a back foot and cause them to have to reconsider how they face this creature. So we've determined that we're going to do a new form of an orc, but we're going to do something a little bit different with it. But how do we make them different? But the next thing we have to figure out is where their placement is on the food chain. Is this creature going to be a lesser version of something you've already seen before? Is it something that's going to fit in the same space as something else on the food chain? So, as an example, the Nikos has the creatures called Starbucks, these small rabbit-like creatures, and there's a lot of unique stuff about them, and perhaps we'll do a monster in a minute on the Starbucks. But the idea is that their placement on the food chain doesn't equal rabbits. As a matter of fact, they're more prized than rabbits, even though they are built on the rabbit archetype. And therefore, because they're more valued, they're going to be more hunted. And therefore, the distinction on the food chain puts them slightly higher than the standard rabbit, and therefore your hunters will consider the specifics of trying to trap these things over capturing other rabbits. And by giving a placement on the food chain, a comparative positioning, not only are you getting a view of what the creature is, but what might be hunting it, what uses it as prey. The placement on the food chain really is determining whether or not it's a threat to the players. And if your beings are always being aggressors towards player characters, creating something that subverts that expectation and perhaps is lower on the food chain gives you an opportunity to get the players to dial down their aggression towards the monsters that you put in the game. And maybe you want to explore a little, find out what they do, find out what they themselves have as a food source, and consider it more holistically. What this does is this broadens your perspective of the very role of a monster in the game and expands the placement thereof, and therefore opens up creativity for your players to actually have to consider how they're going to interact and how they're going to respond to these being types as well. So since we talked about their positioning on the food chain and calling them equivalent to orcs, then they would be in the same place. In other words, they are more than likely themselves an apex predator. Perhaps they are a little higher in the food chain than the standard orc. Maybe they are revered slightly or respected or hated. Who knows? The idea is that you're building this creativity, and by having a clearer picture, by determining where they are on the food chain, you are giving a relative valuation, and therefore determining whether this is something that's to be more prized or more of a threat than it would be otherwise. Next, we need to talk about the creature's environment and lifestyle. And I use the term lifestyle dealing more with the sentient beings, but it also applies for your animals. So, for example, in the case of this being akin to orc, they're going to live in the same stratum. They're going to hunt the same kind of beings. But what is it that I'm going to make different for this particular species is that they consider themselves to be superior to the orc. So therefore they are going to be constantly in conflict, fighting for that supremacy that they desire. And so we're going to be looking at how they came to be. And if they are a unique population, how do they themselves deal with things like reproduction, propagation of their species, expansion of their hunting areas, and the like. And by having an idea of how they came to be, then that gives you a better idea of what their role will be. So in the case of these specialty orc creatures, notice we really haven't created anything yet other than just a perspective mind space for them to exist in. We haven't defined what makes them different yet. And so therefore, perhaps if we make it so that they are aggressors, then they are going to be either enemies of the local population because they failed at their attempt to be superior, or they are going to be in that role of superiority and therefore have a lifestyle akin to, say, the leaders of the local orc populations. And this can be done through actual knowledge, it can be done through religious aspects or superstition, and therefore you can feed into it more depth than you might otherwise. Okay, so now we get down to the part that makes the creation fun. The idea of the marks of the being are what are the traits that are specific for the entirety of this new species. And as I've already kind of in my mind positioned them as a superiorist species, I'm going to also argue that they are there because of superstition and perhaps reaction to their physical marks. And so their identifying marks are going to be, you can create it spontaneously if you want to, or in the master book for NycosRPG, there's a whole list of monstrous marks, and you can just kind of either handpick or even, heaven forbid, roll percentile dice to determine which of the identifying marks you're going to apply to this creature. If you're in a hurry and you're building it out in mass, and you are a world builder and are just building out an entire new biologic stratum, a new biome, then perhaps you'd use the random generator. But for the most part, in this case, I'm particularly picking that these beings have a prehensile tail. So they're an orc that has a tail, and I envision it to be akin to that of an arthropod, so it's like a scorpion's tail. So as far as names are concerned, when you're looking at what you're calling the creature, in this case, we're going to call them the Skork. So yes, I'm very imaginative and creative. Scorpion orc, Skork. Okay, but that tail is perhaps not their only mark. Perhaps they don't have regular hands any longer. Maybe they only have grasping claws. So they have to be treated differently because the way they feed themselves, the way they would arm themselves, and the like is now limited to what they can do with these attacking claws. But so that we've got two marks there very clearly. We've got the replacement claws for hands and claws for forearms, really, and also the prehensile tail. So therefore now they can use their tail for a primary attack, and they've got these claws, and that's pretty distinguishing. So it makes it kind of hard for these beings to hide within an orc population. So instead, perhaps they've been venerated and elevated, and maybe even they might have come to be as a form of a ritual. So that's another of their marks, is that they actually don't reproduce naturally, but are only created by religious or spiritual activity that focuses on creation of this superior version. So now we've got what they look like, we've got the idea of their identifying marks, and we write those into the racial part of the persona packet. So you've got your base numbers, which would be created as you would for any other being, and then you have the separate racial marks that would say prehensile tail and claw replacement, appendage replacement. So once you've got you only need one or two to make them distinctly different enough to be their own thing. Of course, you could go on and add 2 or 3 more if you wanted. The argument less is more simply makes it so there's more variety and more options to adding more versions later. So now we've got the Skork, we've got what they physically look like, therefore we're going to have their attack versions and such, so we have an idea of what skills bases that they might have taken into account, such as the ability to fight multiple targets because they've got multiple limbs and such, and so therefore they are already a greater threat than the standard orc. But these identifying marks it only takes a few seconds to determine those. Next thing we need to consider is their comprehension and cleverness. Now, Obviously, a creature can be clever and not be wise, and so therefore the concept of these being particularly intellectual superiors to the orc doesn't mean that they have to be. As a matter of fact, they may not have anything over on the standard. But the idea here is you need to consider, are they just an aberration, and are they therefore perhaps more monstrous than an orc? Or are they on a communicative level and therefore perhaps guiding the orcs? Their ferocity and perhaps even poison use, if you've provided that for them, these are considerations for how to make the monster unique enough to be memorable. Now, obviously, having a very clever name is a great way to promote their remembrance. If it's a band of orcs and skorks, then the players are going to be aware of it. Maybe it's a subspecies, and so therefore it's an entire clan of these. It's really up to you as a game master, but the idea here is that, are we going to give them an intellectual advantage? Are we going to give them the ability to communicate? Do they have language of their own, or are they simply bestial? And you've got to kind of determine which direction you want to go when it's your persona, your creature you're creating, obviously. Now, we talked about from the exterior why you would want to have this species, but now we're going to look at it from their standpoint. What is their reason for existence? Are they self-loathing? Do they appreciate and understand themselves to be superior? Are they aggressively so? And are they intended to be forever? The idea of using them as a ritual derivation so that all orcs carry the seeds of possibly being skork gives perhaps the rise of a new course for your entire adventure. Maybe these skork are trying to differentiate themselves and therefore are willing to negotiate, willing to communicate, want to be more. Or conversely, they instead are monstrous. You have to choose why they exist. Why do they continue? If they are a one-off only for an adventure, then certainly you don't have to do a lot of detail work on there, but you do have to understand that there are going to be those that think it's fascinating enough that they want to know more about them. So build out for your monster its reason for existing. And now that we've gone through all of the pieces, really this is what we come down to, is that when you are creating a new monster, you have to have a purpose and a reason for it, but they also have to have a reason or a purpose for existing, because otherwise they just are fundamentally window dressing, and you could burn through a new one every week and not have any richness to the world. But if you have actually taken and created these things and then given them a reason to exist, then now it's a propagating thing where that new idea will be among all of your adventures in the future pertain to them. So now let's go back through, and I'm going to demonstrate really quickly the monster in a minute process for this particular creature, and we're going to go right through all the steps again, and as we go through them, we will define particularly the skork. Okay, the niche for the skork in this case are beings that are superior in physical prowess, but are specifically only brought about by ritual. We've determined that they are not specifically a separate species, so the propagation of them can be left in the hands of the orc population itself, but they are venerated and elevated and brought into being by the arguably wisest or the most mystical of the orc population. The reason to have these particular orc is that the orc as a group has been underplayed within the adventure over the last couple of iterations, and I want to venerate and raise up the threat level of an orc incursion by giving yet a new resource within the orc population that can be a threat to the adventuring groups, and in particular will draw enough distinction that the players will be driven to want to know more about this new enemy. They are on the food chain akin to regular orc, except that they demand a certain richness of their diet that requires the standard orc populations to pursue a higher threat risk of raids in order to get them what they need. I haven't figured out what that would necessarily be yet, but by the time we get done, I will. Their environment, lifestyle, they're venerated and kept in isolation from the rest of the orc population simply because of the threat they pose to their kindred, and because of this they are more isolated, more violent, and less able to communicate. They are forage eaters, but they prefer sweetmeats and body internals from mortal populations. Hence, the orcs have now become more of a kidnap-oriented culture and therefore are more of a threat to the local communities, which of course draws again the distinction from the players to come and hunt them. The identifying marks, as we've described, are the replacement of their forearms and hands with a claw-like structure, and that they now also have a prehensile tail that is like a scorpion's that rises up over their shoulders and can attack beings in front of them or to the side of them. I'm going to add into there the idea that they are also very vulnerable to attacks from behind. So these tend to be shock troops that are sent in on the front of the battle because they are only expected to last long enough to have broken the mortal lines and made the advances to make the kidnappings possible by the more mundane orcs of their tribe. Finally, these are not sentient in the classical sense, and neither are they particularly clever. They are basically press and play monsters. They intend to break through lines and are pretty much not able to negotiate, nor would they resign or retire or surrender, because they simply don't have the mind capacity to recognize what that would look like. And then finally, the very reason for these is simply as an engine for supporting the advance of the orc population within the setting that I'm developing, and therefore they are a ground force enhancement that will cause the orcs to be a greater threat to others. Alrighty, so that took me a little over a minute, but the point is that we can do this, as Steve Rogers would say, we can do this all day, because you simply pick a position in a niche and we build that out. In the future, we'll do monster in a minute videos, and I'll be using those as short material going forward. So if you like this idea, let me know. If you've got some ideas of what I should include that I didn't, make sure you leave a comment so I can know what your thoughts are. Really appreciate you all being here. This is NycosRPG, and this has been the Game Master's Toolbox. We will see you at the next time. Remember, we do record Monday through Friday, 10 a.m.-ish to and 11 p.m.-ish, Monday through Friday. We will talk to you later, but remember, as my grandpa says, you've done enough work for today. Go play.